It's not for the faint of heart. And it's certainly not for the ill-prepared. 2 prestigious races. 1,100 miles.
Just took off running, and Tony said...
That's the goal anyway. In one day. A 55-minute flight going back and forth for all the preliminary events and then one last time on race day. But it's not just about what you can control. You need Mother Nature to cooperate. You need both cars to last all day. And you need reliable transportation to cover everything. Maybe if all that works out, you'll conquer it. It's only happened one time, so good luck. What Kyle Larson is trying to accomplish this Memorial Day weekend shouldn't be taken for granted, because it's only happened a handful of times. Even if it doesn't go well, it's still a massive deal. Last year, the weather didn't go his way, but he's not the first to encounter that problem. What the pioneers of this mission endured carved the way for what to look out for and how to do it right. And you have to kind of be programmed a certain way to be crazy enough to try it. This is the Memorial Day Double, and just how tough it is to pull it off. The Indianapolis 500 is the pinnacle of motorsports in the entire world. It doesn't matter what background you come from, any racer with any ambition perks up when that race is mentioned. It has such a rich, storied history dating back to 1911, from an all-brick surface to gasoline alley. Like the Masters in golf or the Super Bowl, legends are born here. No one backs their way into victory lane at Indy. You have to be somebody, the best of the best, something you have to see to believe. The Coca-Cola 600 in NASCAR is the longest stock car race of them all, starting in the daytime, ending under the lights. This race alone can break you. Better hope your AC fans are working, and you better be hydrated. Heartbreak can happen at any moment. Your fuel mileage calculations have to be on point. Maybe when this 4-hour marathon is over, you can finally rest. Now how about doing all of that back to back? There's a reason only 5 guys have attempted it, and they're all world-class talents with a loaded racing history. Before 1992, the double wasn't even feasible. That was when Charlotte Motor Speedway, home of the Coke 600, installed a lighting system and gave the Memorial Day weekend crown jewel a new element by starting it in the late afternoon before transitioning into night. Now the teams had to adjust to 2 different track temperatures and hope their car adapted as the race went on. This was now more than just a long endurance contest, it was a math problem. But what it also did was open the door for both the 600 and the Indy 500 to have their own standalone windows for TV audiences. Race fans could rejoice and wouldn't have to choose between the two. But what it also did was open up the window for a select few drivers who were crazy enough to participate in both of them, adding yet another element to an already action-packed day in all of racing. The first of them, a man with a prolific family history in all of motorsports, John Andretti in 1994. His uncle Mario was one of the all-time greats in not just IndyCar, but all of motorsports, winning the Daytona 500 and Indy 500, plus a case full of championship trophies. And ironically, this would be his final Indy 500. But John wanted to carve his own legacy and show his versatility. This was more than just about the double for him. He wanted to prove a point after getting let go from his full-time ride in the series while tackling stock car racing at the same time. Now he had to qualify before anything else, and the process of making the field for this grand spectacle was far from a given. He had to fly from the West Coast after the Cup Series race in Sonoma, California, and make the field on day 1 of time trials, or he was all but out of luck. On top of that, rain plagued the afternoon and put everything in jeopardy, but he comfortably accomplished that hurdle and was off and running by putting down the 10th fastest lap. He drove for A.J. Foyt at Indy, yet another piece of racing legacy. John paced himself early and stayed out of trouble, ascending as high as 3rd in the first 50 to 60 laps. But a stalled engine on a mid-race pit stop under green lost his ground and he eventually fell off the lead lap. He dropped as low as 12th after halfway and was as many as 5 laps down, which included another stall and a later pit stop, but he would recover for a 10th place finish, salvaging something out of the lackluster performance overall. Despite not technically completing all 500 miles, the first leg of this epic mission was a resounding success, and with the race pace running somewhat long, he had no time to waste in the plane ride to Charlotte, immediately leaving the facility without a TV interview. He arrived in the infield via helicopter at Charlotte Motor Speedway early in the pre-race, putting on his fire suit and spent no time being strapped into his Billy Hagan Racing Chevrolet. He also happened to have a strong qualifying effort for the 600 as well at 9th, but would have to give it up after missing the driver's meeting. He had another tall order of adversity to fight with, but if he was able to keep the fenders on it and come home with a solid finish, it would no doubt go down as one of the all-time impressive achievements in racing history. Unfortunately though, this would all be too much to overcome for John as he stagnated around 37th in the opening laps and lost the back end of the car after being put a lap down and slamming the wall in turn 4. All this took place before the sun went down and prompted several pit stops to repair the damage. He soldiered on many laps down for quite some time, but eventually broke the transmission and bowed out just past halfway, finishing a disappointing 36th and fell well short of the targeted 1,100 miles. But despite all this, he was still able to have a playful interaction with Kenny Wallace behind the wall and take some pride in even attempting this gigantic quest.
I got Jeff Andretti here who made history. John had a tough day, but I don't know, Rusty. We're just struggling along.
John was just in his first full-time season in NASCAR. He was still acclimating to stock cars, period, let alone coming off an entire 500-mile race in a much lighter Indy car. No one was giving him any grief for falling short of expectations, but he officially set the foundation for the next line of drivers to follow the pathway and give another effort to complete it. Robby Gordon is one of the most off-the-chain, unhinged, well-rounded racers you'll ever come across. He's done everything from the Baja 1000 to stadium super trucks to open wheel, and yes, even NASCAR. You mess with him and you'll live to regret it. Don't worry about what he's thinking, he'll be glad to tell you. He perfectly fit the mold of someone who could pull off the Memorial Day double, but would soon be dealt a sobering hand of reality when the weather would simply not let him have a chance in his first attempt in 1997. He qualified a respectable 12th, but that wasn't the issue. On race day, rains plagued IMS and the race wouldn't be able to go green on Sunday, wiping out the chance of a true attempt at double duty in a single day. The Felix Sabates-led project was looking bleak, but Robby could still run all 1,100 miles and settle for an asterisk by the event. However, to keep the day full of drama going, rain was also a factor in Charlotte, meaning there was still an outside chance both races could possibly be run in some capacity on Monday. No one knew what the plan looked like for Robby, but Greg Sachs was on standby in his stock car if he wasn't able to be present for the 600. In the end though, Robby wouldn't even have to worry about it because just before the rains came, he backed the 40 car into the outside wall in similar fashion as Andretti and in the exact same spot in turn 4, 184 laps in. Robby was experiencing leg cramps as well, which seemed to be a concern for how he would fare physically the rest of the way. He was relegated to a 41st place finish and turned his attention to make the most out of the effort at Indy. But everyone would have to wait even longer to see the outcome because Mother Nature just wouldn't go away. After 15 short laps on Monday, the rain would persist the rest of the day and push the remainder of the Indy 500 to Tuesday. Robby had worked his way to 4th at the break and felt totally fine physically and was happy with how the car was performing. But almost instantly when the race finally restarted for good, things went south in a hurry. As Robby was racing up into the top 5 alongside Robbie Buell, he turned into the access road in turn 3, frantically threw all the equipment out of his way, and hopped out as if he was on fire. With the burning sensation still present, he began vigorously rolling on the ground to absolve what he thought was an active flame, even though nothing was visible. Once he settled down, he tried to save the car and bring it back to pit road, but the safety crew wasn't having it. But as it turns out, a methanol leak from the engine is what caused the problem and gave Robby first and second degree burns on his hand and right leg, as was indicated by his fire suit being decolorized. So you want to run the double, kids? Be sure you know what you're getting into. You'd think this would be enough to scare off Robby or anyone else from trying this again, but you're sorely mistaken if you think he was going to be denied that easily. If someone is tough enough to do it once, then nothing phases them. To this point, it seemed like pulling off double duty for these two mammoth races was a pipe dream. If an Andretti and a world-class skilled motorsport expert couldn't come close, then who could? As daunting as it seemed though, 2 attempts is way too small of a sample size to deem this impossible. There's plenty more talent out there capable of tackling this enormous challenge. Enter Tony Stewart, a hard-nosed, all-American pure badass who eats, sleeps, and breathes racing. He came from strictly open-wheel ranks but was freshly introduced to the stock car scene, having dipped into the Busch Grand National Series and entering his rookie season in Cup in 1999. If that wasn't already enough on his plate, he was willing to compete for the double right off the bat, having quickly adapted to NASCAR and already an IndyCar champion. As far as raw talent goes, he seemed to have the best shot at pulling this off thus far. In a fully funded Joe Gibbs entry on the Winston Cup side and Home Depot sponsoring both rides, he had all the support he needed to not only contend, but win both races. After qualifying 24th at Indy, he actually went on to win the Winston Open to transfer to the All-Star race and finish second. The promise was already building with the expectations as high as they could be. In the Indy 500, Tony worked his way up to as high as 5th by lap 40, but faded to around 10th after. He fell off the lead lap eventually as a result of pitting off sequence and not getting the strategy to go his way. He was never really a factor for the win and finished 9th, but with no one even coming close to completing the 1100 miles, the bar wasn't as high as you think. Yes, Tony fell short of expectations at Indy, no question, but like Andretti, a top 10 is nothing to scoff at with all the pressure around the double going on. He was still in line to accomplish one of the all-time racing feats that night if he could contend for the win and bring it home at Charlotte. Tony arrived to a loud, welcoming reception getting off the helicopter on the front stretch and was promptly asked how he was doing physically. He barely looked even the slightest bit winded and showed no signs of fatigue and said he was good to go for 600 miles. He had to of course start in the back due to missing the drivers' meeting, but made a ferocious charge through the field in the opening stage of the race and missed an early wreck by a few feet. He got into the top 10 before sunset and appeared to be well on his way to a successful night. However, just past lap 100 under caution, it hit him.
There's a problem for Tony Stewart in his car. He's extremely hot, and he's feeling a bit nauseous. Says he hasn't eaten a lot all day. The next time he comes in, they're going to give him a power bar. They're also filling some plastic bags full of ice, which they're going to put down his back and put underneath him in the seat to try to cool him off a little bit, but a physical problem right now for Tony Stewart.
Turns out, Tony didn't really prepare as well as he should have for this, and the crew would be supplying him with a heavy dose of power bars and ice bags at each pit stop the rest of the way. Despite all this, he continued gunning forward through traffic like nothing was wrong, displaying the sheer will he had as one of the toughest drivers in the world. He started feeling better towards halfway and continued his ascension into the top 5, and by nighttime he emerged as a serious factor. Jeff Burton and Bobby Labonte were the class of the field all day, but Tony began chasing them down in a hurry and was aiming to crash the party. The notion that he could actually win this race was becoming real, and no longer was this effort just a novelty. Keep in mind, he was a rookie in this series. He took the lead over his teammate Labonte to a roar from the stands and began pulling away, to the disbelief of many. No one was doubting his ability, but the fact that he had already competed in the biggest race in motorsports just hours earlier and was near the end of this one while dealing with all that extreme fatigue, people couldn't fathom what they were seeing, because it had never been done. The dream temporarily paused when he had to check up for the lap car of Mike Skinner and lost all his momentum and went back to 3rd in the process, but he wasn't giving up with over 100 laps still to go. Even though he told his crew he still felt fine, he wanted to catch his breath and save his car for when it counted the most. He retook the lead from Burton at lap 301 and once again looked to pull away and do the unthinkable. After green flag stops, he continued to dazzle in a breathtaking 3-way battle for the lead, but Tony would at last start fading from the lead in the last 70 or so laps, as most people probably expected. Before this, there may have had to be some kind of test done to make sure he was even human. He was still able to nurse it home in 4th, easily meeting expectations for the day and becoming the first driver to successfully attempt the double. He didn't complete all 1100 miles since he wasn't on the lead lap at Indy, but this seemed like as good as you could ask for. When he climbed out and the adrenaline wore off, he was visibly exhausted and put on a stretcher. He was taken to get fluids in the care center and get his body temp down to normal, but other than that, recovered in time to resume his weekly job as a NASCAR driver without missing a beat. He did, however, show what not to do when attempting the double. It was a warning to the rest of the industry. Even though Tony Stewart was finally able to conquer the double, the condition it left him in still didn't present this mission to be remotely manageable to almost anyone. It was clear you had to be cut from a certain cloth to be equipped for it, no matter how successful you were in your respective division. Turns out it would be a repeat driver in the next attempt, with Robby Gordon going back at it the next year in 2000. After Mother Nature fully disrupted his first try, you could bet he was going to go for redemption. But unfortunately, the rain was not ready to leave him alone. It delayed the start of the Indy 500 for 2.5 hours, but this time Robby wasn't going anywhere. He was going to prioritize Indianapolis and deal with the Coke 600 repercussions later. Now there's an added wrinkle to this story. In the year prior, while Tony was in the midst of pulling off the most impressive run in motorsports history to date, Robby was 2 laps from winning the greatest spectacle when he ran out of gas coming to the white flag. So if you thought just trying the double again was enough redemption for him, this sent it over the edge. He was slated to start 4th this time, being in another prime spot to hopefully add this illustrious race title to his resume. Now, much like 97, rain was affecting both Indy and Charlotte, so not only did Robby have to worry about the ever-changing factor of this race, but if he was going to be able to run the Coke 600 or wait till Monday, everything was on the table. Having to play it by the minute in a setting this intense had to send the team stress to the max. But the weather finally moved out at Indy and the race commenced eventually, at least giving Robby some sort of clarity on his plan for the day. He made a bold move at the start on the inside of his teammate Greg Ray and had a strong car. He was in the top 10 for the entire race and even got as high as second in the first half, but had nothing for Juan Pablo Montoya. He still brought it home on the lead lap in 6th, finally completing the long, dragged-out day in Indianapolis through a bout with rain, but there was one problem. The Coca-Cola 600 had already started. The team had to go with their backup plan and start P.J. Jones in the Cup car, and Robby would have to make his way down there as fast as he could. It wouldn't be a true attempt at the double, but that was all out of his control. As it turns out, rain halted the action in the 600 just past halfway, and Robby arrived in time to be able to jump in without having to make a rush driver swap during a live pit stop. Now, to be fair to PJ, nothing was expected of him, except keeping the car out of trouble and giving Robby a chance to get in at some point to salvage what he could. This was his own independent team after all. There was some slight damage on the right side panel, but nothing to disrupt the rest of the race. What did, however, disrupt it was a whopping 5-lap penalty when the field went back to green for disobeying a NASCAR official. No explanation was ever given on the broadcast, but it sounds like either the team worked on the car under the red flag, which is prohibited, or Robby was being Robby and had some sort of disagreement that led to it. Either way, this completely derailed his night and he limped it home in 35th, putting a sour ending on an otherwise respectable day for their attempt at the double. So now that Robby Gordon took his second shot at history, it was natural that Tony Stewart would follow that up after falling just short of all-time racing glory. What he did in 1999 was absurd, but he wasn't satisfied. He wanted to win the Indy 500 and showed the potential to do so with backing from Joe Gibbs and Home Depot. But this time, he needed more help and a better training regimen to prevent such a medical catastrophe from happening again. In 2001, Tony would get his own shot at redemption, and who would have thought what he was able to pull off in the second go-around. This time, Tony turned to an IndyCar power in Chip Ganassi, even though he had no ties to him in NASCAR. He knew Chip would supply him with the equipment capable of realizing his dream, having Montoya smoke the field a year prior. Everything was coming together, and Tony had his sights set on history that could never be topped. Now, in order for this to properly be achieved, his physical preparation and health had to be just as much of a priority as the cars. Tony hired a strength and conditioning trainer, and his team was much more involved in keeping him hydrated and improving his diet in the weeks leading up to race day, and it paid dividends when it came to the conclusion of the 600. It was so out of hand in '99, he was hallucinating in the car towards the end of that marathon. With all that straightened out, the speed was flashing early on. He secured a 7th place starting spot for the Indy 500, but the attention quickly turned once again to that pesky weather. Rain was a major factor yet again, and it seemed like it could come after halfway, deeming the race official if it ever got to that point. Now, Tony turned out to not be much of a factor for the entire first half of the race, idling around the back half of the top 10. It wasn't until after halfway when he finally started making ground towards the leaders and into the top 5. But under caution and during pit stops at lap 135, the teammates of Gil de Ferran and Helio Castroneves pulled out just in front of Tony and got penalized for a lane violation, and the officials placed Tony in the lead. Suddenly, the checkered flag was in sight and the hype went through the roof about the conceivable idea that he could actually win this race. He told his team over the radio it only took him about 135 laps to remember how to do this. On the restart, Tony was able to maintain the lead and keep Castroneves at bay. But under the next caution with 50 to go, he came in for a splash of fuel and was back to 5th with others staying out. And to make matters worse, he started experiencing cramping and numbness in his right foot, as in the one that holds the gas pedal down. He got his physician who traveled with him on the headset for some advice, but there wasn't much to be done. He just had to find a way to make it work. Thankfully, under that same caution, the expected showers rolled in and put a temporary stop to the race. Now, this was a double-edged sword because this obviously narrowed the window for Tony to leave for Charlotte on time, but he hopped out of the car and much like Robby Gordon the year prior, he told a panicked Chip Ganassi he wasn't going anywhere. It was Tony's childhood dream to win the Indianapolis 500, and it was within arm's reach. He wasn't about to let anything get in the way of that, and he was willing to deal with the consequences on the NASCAR side later. He did have to make a trip to the infield care center and receive some treatment on his cramping issue, but the rain was brief and the race was able to resume in enough time for Tony to keep going. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to keep pace the rest of the way and stalled the car leaving pit road on his last stop. He had to settle for a distant 6th place, which was undeniably disappointing, but he led 13 laps and finished on the lead lap. Whether the cramping in his right leg had anything to do with it was left for everyone else to decide, but nevertheless, he promptly left the facility in a helicopter at 2:45 Central, just 9 minutes after the race ended, and in just enough time to make the Coke 600. He loaded up on 2 liters of IVs during the flight to Charlotte, getting all the hydration he could to maximize his effort for the second part of the task. He arrived at the airport just outside Charlotte at 4:53 Eastern and immediately started stretching out his leg with his trainer to mitigate any further issues. When he got to the track, he once again received a standing ovation and began to refocus his attention to the heavier stock car and go a longer distance than he had earlier in the day. He had to once again start in the back, and he would spin out all by himself from the get-go on lap 2. Concerns were raised about if he was already physically out of gas, but that theory would be swatted down over the course of the evening. He owned up to making a mistake on the radio and got the necessary service needed on pit road to fix the front valence. You had to think that adjustment to the much more significant weight of his Pontiac played a part in the incident. After that minor setback, the charge was on and he made his way into the top 20 over 100 laps in. There was a long green flag run in the middle portion and he was not far from losing a lap at one point, but was saved by a caution. By lap 211, he was up to 13th and finally coming to life. By nightfall, he was in the top 10, and with each passing lap from there, he crawled ever so closer to contention. The Home Depot crew dialed in the car gradually throughout the race, and the adjustments really kicked in when it counted. He moved into 4th past Jimmy Spencer with 23 to go, but it became apparent he needed a caution to be within striking distance of a win. In the end, he was the fastest car out there and marched into 3rd, eating into the lead, but didn't have enough time to catch Jeff Burton. But above all else, this was celebrated by Tony and his team, and it should have been. Despite falling short in both races, he did complete all 1,100 miles and got out of the car under his own power and was standing proud with a smile on his face as he gave an interview. In hindsight, expecting to win both these races is a bit irrational, but he got about as close as you could. He did everything right. He prepared physically, was paired with more than adequate teams to give him the best chance to win, and had enough talent to pull it off. But the thing about racing that's the biggest X factor is the circumstances. You can only control what you can control. Not the weather, not the cautions falling, or what others around you can do. Given all these facts, Tony excelled. This was still a phenomenal accomplishment he laid down, and it was enough to satisfy his need to run the double, having never attempted it again. In 2002, Robby Gordon would go for his 3rd attempt, and the weather finally left him alone this time. He hadn't come close to checking off all 1,100 miles to this point, but most of that was totally out of his control. Now with rain not a factor, he had as good a shot as ever to get over the hump. During the Indy 500, his team had another scary and possible flammable situation on pit road under caution when the fuel hose didn't come undone from the car properly, and in turn, the lid on the fuel tank was blown off and the crew had to scramble to extinguish any fire from erupting among anyone in the vicinity of their stall. Nothing catastrophic happened, but it did cost them all their fuel. Luckily, Greg Ray, who was out of the race, lent them his now unoccupied stall, and the Menards team made the switch for the remainder of the race. Outside of that, Robby's day was mostly uneventful, which is actually what he needed, considering how most of his luck at Indy went. He came home in 8th, but most importantly on the lead lap, keeping his goal of 1,100 intact. He arrived on the scene in Charlotte at 4:29 p.m., ready to roll for 600 miles, with seemingly no signs of slowing down. Like Tony, he hydrated plenty on the way in and was fired up about the reception from the fans. As per usual, he made the obligatory last place start for missing the drivers' meeting, but he and the singular team didn't wait around and methodically worked their way forward. They went with early pit strategy by taking fuel only and restarted in the top 5 after an early caution. Robby actually held his own for much of the daytime portion of the 600 and hovered around the top 15. It helped being with Richard Childress Racing now, far better equipment than his previous independent team. But about 155 laps in, he began complaining of cramps in his ribs and considered using a padding device when he got a chance. This would obviously take time and cause him to lose ground, but could it be worth it to help him make it to the end? The concern for his physical state was growing, with a broadcast speculating how tired he was, but given the fact he was up to 9th, it was clear he could handle it in the meantime. With about 180 to go, and as the sun fell, Robby's car wasn't keeping up with the track and he faded off the lead lap. Now this was critical because this jeopardized his chance at all 1,100 miles, but there was still a ways to go. Nothing would really improve, however, and he never recovered. He had a close call with Ken Schrader in the closing laps, just trying to hang on, and he never got the chance to get back on the lead lap, crossing the line in 16th. He was visibly exhausted after the race and revealed the cramps ramped up towards the end, and this was no doubt a disappointing outcome, but by far his best performance in the double. Despite 3 attempts and being just 1 lap short of completing it, Robby was back for more the very next year. His competitive drive was so high, he continued to crave his daunting challenge year after year. Keep in mind, he had been in the Baja 1000, so this wasn't as foreign to him as everyone else. This time, he was on the front row at Indy with Andretti Green Racing and had all the confidence in the world he could win both races. but his hopes were dashed fairly quickly as his car just wasn't up to speed and he lagged behind at the end of the lead lap most of the race. Then a gearbox going bad officially retired him from the 500 with a 22nd place finish, leading to an early exit and a police escort to the airport bound for Charlotte. He took 2 more IVs on the flight than he did the year before and hoped to be in better shape by the end of the night. At the start, Robby didn't really make much ground and went a lap down early. It looked like the whole day was a lost cause at this point, but he did get it back later and got up to as high as 11th. But he just couldn't stay on the lead lap with the way the cautions fell, and turns out Mother Nature reared her ugly head again and he never got the chance to finish, with the forgettable 17th to cap off a forgettable double attempt. At last, in 2004, Robby would make his final attempt at the double, and wouldn't you know it, as one final jab at him, the weather would interfere big time. Another lengthy delay of about 2 hours pushed back the start time of the Indy 500, and once again he found himself in this guessing game of what scenarios could happen. As polarizing as Robby was, you had to feel for him knowing that all the work that went into this process kept getting spoiled year after year. He was already hoping the 500 would get pushed to Monday to give him enough breathing room to focus on each race as their own event, and stressed he needed to be headed out to Charlotte by 2:45 Central. As the track dried and preparations were made to get going, the race went green but only lasted 22 laps before rain brought the action to a stop. The track was completely lost and it looked like the race wouldn't be resumed the rest of the day. Given the circumstances, Robby had no choice but to head out and rely on coming back the next day. He felt confident that would be the case, but had relief driver Jacques Lazier on standby if needed. After another couple of hours in a holding pattern, the race would indeed get back underway and Lazier got his seat time. It wouldn't be a happy ending though, as a broken axle just before halfway cut the team's efforts short. To make matters worse, things continued to unravel in the Coke 600 with Robby falling off the lead lap 47 laps in and never seeing it again. He finished a distant 3 laps down in 20th and unceremoniously bowed out from this stage the rest of his career. For the next 7 years, starting in 2005, the start time of the Indy 500 would be pushed back an hour from its traditional start time to noon Central Time. This made the double all but impossible to pull off, and as a result, no driver attempted it during this time period. TV ratings had to play a part in the time change, but it certainly took away a superhero act from any driver to give race fans a unique experience. Fortunately, in 2011, however, the time slot got moved back to its former start time and would reopen the opportunity for another double. Since 1999, only 2 drivers had opted for the task, but a new challenger would refresh the hype in 2014. And it was a driver with the same competitive makeup and edge as the previous 2. That would be Kurt Busch, the outlaw, transitioning into the second half of his career. He had been at the mountaintop of NASCAR and kicked down to the basement, but he had just gotten a chance to revive his legacy with fittingly Tony Stewart at Stewart-Haas Racing. Interestingly enough, in 2006, Kurt came to Indy to observe the start of the 500, given that was all he had time for in the newly compacted race schedule. That had to pique his interest, especially in the midst of his first season with Roger Penske. 7 years later, he would partake in a test session for the Andrettis and pass the rookie test for the Indy 500. The next year, he would follow through and be the first driver in a decade to take on the double, and the excitement was reinvigorated in the racing community. Kurt wanted to personally challenge himself. He wanted to see how far he could go. He posted the 10th fastest lap in qualifying in his first attempt and ended up starting 12th, sending a statement to the field that he was capable of hanging with the big guys. He would face adversity in practice when he experienced a frightening crash, having to go to a backup car, but everything was still in front of him. Unlike Tony and Robby, Kurt had no open-wheel background. The expectations for him weren't the same, but he wasn't bothered by that. That's why the Andrettis took a chance with him. Early on, Kurt settled in and logged laps, just learning whatever race knowledge he could and not being too aggressive. He fell back to 20th at one point, and it looked like the task might be too big for him. The car was too free, and the team added some minor downforce, and as the race went on, Kurt rallied back into the top 10. With just over 50 to go, he was in 9th and suddenly had a great finish on the table. He would end up 6th on the lead lap, passing the test with flying colors and proving how versatile he was. He got his IV and sandwich on the flight to Charlotte, looking well on his way to a Tony Stewart-esque Herculean effort to dazzle race fans with back-to-back superb finishes on the day. In the Coke 600, he fell a lap down early but took a wave around under caution to get back into contention. He was periodically being given cubed peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to keep his protein intake sufficient when the time presented itself, and he maintained top 15 track position by halfway, but this would be about as good as it got. After dealing with a broken shock absorber, the 41 car started dropping cylinders and heartbreak would strike with a blown engine not long after. He finished 40th, but wouldn't let that disappointment overshadow his outstanding run at Indianapolis with Michael Andretti, and he still joined an exclusive list of elite talents that had the guts to go 1,100 miles in one day. And this brings us to 2024. After another decade of dormancy, the anticipation returned in a big way when world-class, versatile phenom Kyle Larson took on the challenge. If you've been following along and have an idea about how the previous drivers to try the double carried themselves, Larson fits seamlessly into that category. There's no stage that he would run from. He has the competitive edge, the well-rounded ability, the physical condition to pull it off. It was announced the previous year in a joint effort consisting of Arrow McLaren and Hendrick Motorsports. This had the feel of Tony Stewart's hefty funded effort in 2001 with IndyCar juggernaut Chip Ganassi and his well-established Joe Gibbs NASCAR team. The conceivable notion that he could win both races was very real, but he too had to tangle with Mother Nature herself, not unlike Robby Gordon, who came before him. With a strong storm system rolling in, it seemed like a foregone conclusion there was little chance the Indy 500 would go on as scheduled on Sunday. But as the afternoon progressed, it became apparent there was a window of opportunity to get the race in after all, and Larson and Hendrick right-hand man Jeff Gordon had a decision to make. On par with Kurt Busch, Larson had no IndyCar experience, about the only type of cockpit he hadn't jumped into. Given all the man-hours and max effort that went into this endeavor, and not knowing if or when he would get the chance again, Larson elected to stay in Indianapolis even though he was firmly in the championship hunt on the NASCAR Cup side. This was an opportunity he couldn't pass up, so would he make it count? Early on he was in contention as most expected, but after halfway he was hit with a speeding penalty on pit road and doomed any chance he had with such little time to recover. He was forced to settle for a disappointing 18th and had to take off for Charlotte as fast as he could in hopes of salvaging whatever pride he could for Hendrick. In the 600, however, weather would become a major factor as well, but the race did start as scheduled. Hendrick adjacent driver Justin Allgaier, an Xfinity Series champion, was called to fill in for the 5 team in the meantime, but as soon as Larson arrived at the facility, rain began to fall and brought the race to a red flag. Kyle was as hopeful as anyone that the rain would pass and he could at least be there for his team to make an effort to give them the best finish possible after being absent for most of the night, but it was ultimately not to be. He was left hanging as the race got called early, robbing this highly anticipated effort of coming to fruition. So what did we learn here? What does it take to pull off the double? You definitely have to train physically and hydrate often, like Tony Stewart learned the hard way. You need the weather to act right in 2 different locations at once, or you might be screwed like Robby Gordon. When you get to Charlotte for the 600, you have to block out the fact that you've already raced 500 miles like Kurt Busch said, or it'll get in your head and accelerate the fatigue. If you make a pit road mistake like Kyle Larson, forget about winning both races. This goes so far beyond 2 races in one day. This is training and preparing your body for over a month. It's going back and forth on an hour flight for 2 weeks to accommodate both racing obligations. It's constantly having a camera and microphone in front of you everywhere you turn. There is no time to breathe. There's no time to rest. You have to want it bad enough. That's why only 5 drivers have tried it and 1 succeeded. They normalized the double, but that doesn't make it any less suffocating. Here's hoping Kyle pulls it off this time and gives him closure after a botched attempt in 2024. He's earned it. Now it's time to go do it. This has been a Platinum Paradise video.